There comes a moment, silent, yet thunderous, when the patience of the empath, that soft and enduring vessel of receptivity, collapses into something unrecognizable even to itself. You must understand that patience is not infinite. It is a rope woven of countless threads of compassion, threads that can be frayed by constant abrasion. The empath believes that to endure the pain of others is a calling, a sacred mission, but hidden beneath this conviction is a shadow that few dare to confront. For patience, when demanded endlessly, becomes servitude to disrespect, and disrespect is the poison that corrodes the soul's natural dignity. I tell you this not to encourage rebellion against compassion, but to awaken you to the truth that unchecked tolerance can become an unconscious pact with one's own annihilation. When an empath is disrespected, they often remain silent, swallowing the insult as if their silence might transmute the venom into wisdom. But silence, in this case, is not alchemy. It is repression. The insult descends into the unconscious, joining the voices of other swallowed injuries. And from these repressed fragments, the shadow grows. This is why the empath often finds themselves suddenly overwhelmed by emotions that seem disproportionate to the moment. It is not the present offense alone that wounds them. It is the cumulative eruption of 1,000 small humiliations, each one denied expression, now demanding recognition in a flood. The ending of patience is never a sudden act. It is the breaking of a dam that has long been under unseen pressure. Disrespect is not merely a social failing, it is a psychic assault. To be disrespected is to be denied recognition of your individuality, to be treated as if your existence is less than whole. For the empath, whose identity is entwined with the recognition of others, this denial cuts doubly deep. They live by resonance, by feeling the currents of another's soul, and when those currents return disdain or indifference, the empath is cast into disorientation. They ask themselves, did I imagine this? Did I create the very disrespect I am now enduring? This reflexive self-doubt is the wound of the anima, the feminine principle within us all that seeks affirmation through relationship. And yet, I must insist, disrespect is real, and it must be confronted, not absorbed. Like a toxin you believe you are destined to neutralize. You see, the archetype of the empath is closely bound to that of the wounded healer. It is no coincidence that those who feel most deeply are often those who were wounded earliest. The empath's capacity for patience, for bearing the unbearable, originates not in innate virtue, but in survival. As children, they endured disrespect in silence. For to speak out was to risk abandonment, and abandonment to the child's psyche is equivalent to death. Thus, patience became armor, and silence became strategy. But armor worn too long fuses with the skin, and strategies of survival calcify into identities. The empath begins to believe they are patience incarnate, forgetting that beneath the armor lies a soul yearning not merely to endure but to be honored. Dreams often betray this truth. An empath may dream of being trapped in a house that is not their own, surrounded by voices that demand attention, yet never listen in return. They may find themselves holding water in a sieve, endlessly pouring themselves out while never retaining nourishment. These dreams are not random. They are symbols of the psychic imbalance that results when patience is divorced from boundary. The sieve is the empath's energy, leaking without containment. The house is the collective psyche of others in which the empath is imprisoned. Only when such dreams are confronted with conscious reflection can the empath begin to see that their endurance is not divinity but compulsion, not grace but repetition of trauma. Now, when patience ends, what emerges is often shocking to the empaths themselves. Anger, raw and volcanic, surges through the carefully maintained surface. And here lies a paradox. The anger is not pathology, but medicine. It is the voice of the shadow, the guardian of dignity, finally breaking through the repression that has silenced it for so long. But because the empath has disowned anger, believing it to be unworthy of their gentle nature, they experience it as alien, even demonic. They say, "This is not me. I am not the one who burns with fury." And yet it is precisely them. It is the other half of their wholeness. The energy that has waited in exile to demand respect where patience alone has failed. The task, therefore, is not to banish anger, but to integrate it. To see that this respect cannot always be transformed by endurance. Sometimes it must be met by the fierce assertion of one's worth. In alchemical terms, the blackness of anger is the nigredo, the dark stage that precedes transformation. Out of that black soil, the gold of individuation can be born. The empath must descend into this darkness, into their own rage, not to be consumed by it, but to reclaim it as their rightful power. For in the unconscious lies the archetype of the warrior, and even the gentlest soul must awaken it when dignity is under siege. Consider how the archetype of Christ has been distorted in this regard. We see him as the lamb who endured insult and injury without protest. And indeed this is true, but we forget the Christ who overturned the tables in the temple, who with righteous fury expelled the money changers. The empath remembers only the lamb and represses the lion. And thus they become sacrificial victims in the temple of disrespect. Yet wholeness demands both. To handle disrespect is not merely to forgive, it is also to know when to assert, when to draw the line, when to declare, no more. The true Christ image contains both sacrifice and sovereignty, both patience and the power to confront. I say to you, the ending of patience is not the end of empathy. It is the rebirth of empathy into maturity. To endure disrespect endlessly is to betray the self, and betrayal of the self is the deepest wound of all. When patience ends, the empath is given an opportunity to encounter their shadow, to see in its fury the guardian of their integrity. This is not weakness, this is individuation. And individuation is always born from tension between light and dark, between endurance and rebellion, between compassion and self-respect. Only by holding these opposites without collapsing into either extreme does the soul grow whole. The challenge, however, is that when the empath first encounters disrespect with newfound courage, they are accused of being cruel, selfish, or changed for the worse. Those who have benefited from their endless patience are unsettled by the shift. The empath must resist the temptation to retreat, to apologize for the strength of their voice. This is the initiation. To withstand not only the disrespect, but the backlash that comes when one no longer consents to it. In that crucible, the empath discovers that true patience is not passive endurance, but conscious choice. It is no longer the patience of the child surviving neglect, but the patience of the adult who knows their worth and chooses carefully when to give and when to withhold. Thus, the guide I offer you is not a set of rules, but a call to awakening. When your patience ends, it is not failure. It is the soul insisting that you honor the archetype of dignity. Handling disrespect is not about retaliation, nor about eternal tolerance. It is about integration. To meet it with silence is repression. To meet it with violence is shadow uncontained. But to meet it with clear and grounded assertion, that is individuation, that is the emergence of the self, and in that moment, the empath ceases to be merely a wounded healer repeating their childhood script. They become a whole person, luminous yet rooted, compassionate yet unyielding, finally at peace with both their light and their shadow. When patience has ended and the voice of the shadow begins to rise, the empath encounters a fork in the psychic path. One road leads back into repression, where they attempt to reclothe themselves in silence, convincing the world and themselves that their eruption was a mistake. That anger has no place in the temple of empathy. The other road, however, leads into the forest of individuation, where one must confront the wild animals of the unconscious, the dream figures who embody the very qualities long denied. It is not enough to speak of boundaries in the abstract. They must be experienced in the soul, seen in dreams, felt in the body, and enacted in life, for the psyche will not tolerate an endless cycle of self-sacrifice. The unconscious, like a neglected God, eventually demands to be honored. In the language of dreams, disrespect often appears as figures who mock, belittle, or ignore the dreamer. The dreamer may find themselves naked in a crowd, their voice drowned out by laughter, or struggling to defend themselves while their words turn to dust. These dreams are not punishments, but revelations. They unveil the truth that the ego has abandoned its throne, leaving the kingdom of the self vulnerable to invasion. The empath who accepts disrespect without protest has, in symbolic terms, left their crown unattended. And what is unattended in the psyche becomes possessed by shadow. The mocking dream figures are not merely external aggressors, they are the internalized voices of those who once disrespected the dreamer, voices now animated in the unconscious until they are faced with awareness. I have seen patients whose entire demeanor was that of bowed shoulders, quiet eyes, and a voice that trailed off before completing a sentence. They were embodiments of patience, but also of invisibility. And invisibility is the soil in which disrespect flourishes. When one does not claim their full presence, others will unconsciously sense the absence and treat it as permission to diminish. This is not cruelty alone. It is the psychic law that what is unclaimed within will be projected without. The empath, by refusing to own their power, attracts those who would abuse it, not as cosmic punishment, but as a mirror, as an invitation to see what has been lost in themselves. Let us speak of archetypes here. For archetypes are the eternal patterns through which human life is lived. The empath resonates with the archetype of the Great Mother, the nurturer who gives without end, who gathers the wounded to her breast and holds their suffering. But the Great Mother has two faces. One is nurturing, but the other is devouring. If the empath refuses to set boundaries, they unconsciously invoke the devouring aspect, not against others but against themselves. They become consumed by their own giving, hollowed out by patience turned into martyrdom. To remain only in the light phase of the archetype is to court destruction. One must integrate the darker phase to say, I give because I choose, but I will not give when it violates my soul. In this way, the archetype is balanced, and the empath emerges not as victim, but as sovereign caretaker of their own psychic energy. Here, the role of anger becomes clearer. Anger is the sword of the self. It is not meant to slash indiscriminately, but to cut away what does not belong, to sever ties with what disrespects the dignity of the soul. The empath who disowns anger disowns their sword, and thus they remain defenseless in a world that does not always honor gentleness. To reclaim anger is not to become cruel, but to rediscover the capacity for protection. In myth, every nurturing goddess has her warrior counterpart. Isis, who heals but also commands spells of fierce banishment. Kali, who embraces but also destroys illusion. Mary, who is tender but also crushes the serpent underfoot. The empath must recognize this duality, that love without power is incomplete, and power without love is tyranny. True individuation demands the marriage of both. Disrespect then becomes a teacher. It arrives like an unwelcome visitor, but it carries the gift of revelation. It forces the empath to see where they have abandoned themselves, where they have mistaken tolerance for transformation. When the soul is disrespected, a fire is lit in the unconscious, and this fire can either burn destructively or illuminate the path to wholeness. The choice lies in whether the empath turns inward to confront the shadow or outward to merely reenact the same pattern. To turn inward is to ask, why does this wound pierce me so deeply? What in me has agreed to carry this weight? These questions do not absolve the offender, but they liberate the empath from endless repetition, for one cannot control the actions of others, but one can awaken to the archetypes that rule within. In the seminar halls of the psyche, I often hear the cry, but if I confront disrespect, will I not become what I despise? Will I not lose my empathy? This fear is understandable, for the empath identifies so completely with patients that they see any act of self-assertion as betrayal. But this is illusion. To assert oneself is not to abandon empathy. It is to give empathy a firm foundation. Only when the vessel is intact can it hold water. Only when the empath honors themselves can they truly honor others. Otherwise, their giving is but a disguised plea for recognition, a silent hope that their endurance will finally earn respect. Yet, respect cannot be earned through denial of the self. It must be claimed through presence of the self. Notice how the psyche communicates through symbols. A patient once dreamed of carrying a fragile bird in their hands, protecting it from storms, feeding it crumbs from their own mouth. Yet, in the dream, the bird never grew stronger, never flew. The patient awoke, exhausted, realizing that their care had become captivity. This is the empath's dilemma: to protect so completely that the other never learns to fly, while the self grows weary from endless sacrifice. The dream revealed the shadow truth. Their patience was not love but fear. The fear that without their endurance they would no longer be needed. This is the secret wound of the empath patience as a disguise for terror of abandonment. When patience ends, this terror must be faced, and only by facing it does one discover that the soul does not depend on being endlessly needed, but on being authentically respected. The end of patience, therefore, is not collapse but initiation. It is the threshold where the empath ceases to be child and becomes adult in the psyche. The child endures disrespect because survival depends upon it. The adult confronts disrespect because dignity demands it. This transition is terrifying, for it feels like death, the death of the old identity, the death of the persona that was always agreeable, always kind, always the vessel of others' needs. Yet, in Jungian psychology, death is always the prelude to rebirth. The empath who dares to let their patients die is reborn into wholeness. They are no longer merely the healer. They become the integrated being who can nurture and protect, endure and resist, love and demand love in return. When you next encounter disrespect, I invite you to see it not merely as insult, but as mirror. It reflects the part of you that still hides your crown, that still doubts your worth, that still fears the power of your shadow. To handle it wisely is to stand tall in that moment, to let the voice of anger rise without drowning in it, to let the boundaries of selfhood emerge like the walls of a sacred temple. For every soul is a temple, and every temple requires both open doors for welcome and strong walls for protection. Without the walls, the temple collapses into rubble. Without the doors, it suffocates in isolation. To be whole is to hold both. Thus I say again, when the empath's patience ends, it is not failure but fulfillment. It is the psyche demanding completion, the shadow demanding to be seen, the self demanding to be sovereign. You are not abandoning empathy. You are liberating it from chains. You are not betraying compassion. You are allowing it to stand alongside power. And in this alchemy, disrespect loses its poison, for it no longer defines you. You have faced it, you have integrated its lesson, and you have emerged not merely patient, not merely empathic, but whole. In every age, the problem of disrespect is not merely personal, but collective. The empath in their individual life carries on their shoulders something that the entire culture has failed to reconcile. You may think of your pain as uniquely yours, yet you are woven into the great web of the collective unconscious, where archetypes move like hidden rivers, shaping the fate of generations. When you endure disrespect silently, you echo the countless ancestors whose voices were silenced by power, by oppression, by the demand to conform. And when you finally say no, when patience ends and the shadow speaks, you are not merely asserting yourself, you are healing an ancestral wound. You are allowing the collective to glimpse what has long been buried. I have seen it in dreams. A patient dreams of standing before a tribunal, accused of crimes they did not commit. Their words dismissed by faceless judges. The dreamer awakens in tears, feeling the weight not only of their own life, but of centuries of injustice. This is the mystery of the psyche. The personal wound is never purely personal. It is an archetypal drama, and in confronting it, you stand in the arena with countless souls who came before you. To handle disrespect is therefore not a trivial matter of etiquette. It is a ritual act, a rebalancing of the cosmic scales. Every time you confront it with dignity, you participate in the restoration of order in the psychic cosmos. Let us not romanticize endurance. There is a difference between sacrifice that is freely chosen and sacrifice that is imposed by the disrespect of others. When you freely choose sacrifice for love, for creation, for a higher calling, it is noble and transformative. But when it is imposed through disregard, through denial of your humanity, it becomes corruption, a distortion of the archetype. The empath often confuses the two, believing that to endure even disrespect is somehow holy, but holiness does not consist in allowing the divine spark within you to be trampled. Holiness requires that you guard the flame, that you honor the soul's dignity, for it is through that flame that the self communicates with the world. Think of the archetype of the king or queen. Their role is not to be endlessly patient with those who mock their authority. Their role is to embody justice, to protect the realm, to demand respect, not for ego's sake, but for the sake of order itself. When the empath discovers this archetype within, they realize that their own dignity is not negotiable, for it is part of the great fabric of meaning. To tolerate disrespect endlessly is to allow the kingdom to fall into chaos. To assert boundaries is not vanity, it is sovereignty. In that act, you reclaim the throne of your own psyche. And only from that throne can you rule your life with wisdom. But I know the fear that arises. The empath trembles at the thought of saying no, of refusing, of disappointing others. They imagine abandonment, rejection, the collapse of every bond they have built. Yet this fear itself is the echo of childhood, where no was dangerous, where refusal led to punishment or withdrawal of love. You must see that the fear belongs to the child, not to the adult self. The adult who says no does not risk annihilation. They risk only the loss of those who never truly respected them. And is that loss not liberation? For what is the value of a bond built on disrespect? What is the worth of a love that requires your silence as its condition? It is better to stand alone in dignity than to be surrounded in false harmony. The collective resists this awakening. Cultures often sanctify the empath's silence, praising patience while secretly exploiting it. We see it in institutions, in families, in religions. The silent sufferer is held up as the ideal, while the one who speaks is condemned as rebellious or ungrateful. But this is not the voice of the self, it is the voice of a collective shadow that thrives on imbalance. To confront disrespect is therefore to confront not only individuals, but the very systems that have normalized the silencing of sensitivity. This is why the empath often feels such backlash when they finally assert themselves. It is not merely personal resistance, it is archetypal resistance. The inertia of centuries of unconscious patterns. Yet this resistance is proof that the act is sacred, that the no spoken in truth has power to shift the unseen order. Saying no is not aggression. It is consecration. It is the act of drawing a circle around the temple of your soul and declaring, this is sacred ground. You may enter only with reverence. In myth, the guardian at the gate is often fierce, armed with sword or flame, not because they hate, but because they protect the holy. The empath must recognize that their own boundaries are such gates, and their anger is the flame that guards them. To suppress that flame is to leave the temple open to desecration. To wield it consciously is to honor the divine within, and when others recoil at this fire, it is not proof of your cruelty, but of their inability to approach with respect. The fire does not destroy what is true, it only consumes what is false. Dreams will confirm this transformation, where once you were silent in the tribunal, now you dream of finding your voice, of speaking words that silence the accusers. Where once the bird in your hands could not fly, now it spreads its wings and soars, leaving you free to walk unburdened. Where once the house was filled with demanding voices, now the walls grow strong, and you find your own room where silence is sacred. These are not fantasies. They are signals that the unconscious recognizes your growth, that the archetypes have shifted, that the self is rebalancing its forces. The psyche always rewards truth with images of liberation, but understand, individuation does not mean eradicating patience. It means transforming it from compulsion into choice. The mature empath does not abandon compassion, they refine it. They no longer give because they must, but because they choose, because the giving arises from fullness rather than depletion. Their patience is no longer the silence of repression, but the spaciousness of wisdom. They can endure much, but not everything. They can forgive, but not deny. They can love, but not at the cost of their own soul. This is the paradox of individuation, that by integrating the shadow of anger, patience itself becomes more luminous, more powerful, more authentic. Disrespect will always exist in the world. You cannot eliminate it, just as you cannot eliminate shadow from the psyche, but you can learn to meet it without collapse, without endless self-betrayal. You can stand as the temple stands, open yet guarded, compassionate yet sovereign. This is not a lesson of the mind alone, but of the whole soul. It must be lived in the body, felt in the tightening of the chest when you are dismissed, heard in the tremor of the voice when you finally say enough. Each of these moments is a sacred rite, a small death and a rebirth, an alchemical step in the great work of becoming whole. So I tell you, when your patience ends, do not despair. Do not apologize for the fire that rises in you. Do not retreat into silence once more. Listen to the shadow, honor the archetype, and let the self speak with authority, for in that moment you are not merely defending yourself, you are participating in the great drama of the psyche, where light and dark meet, where compassion and power embrace, where the soul becomes whole at last. The soul longs not only to endure, but to reconcile. When the empath finally speaks, when the silence fractures and the anger rises, there is often a wave of guilt that follows, a sorrow for having stepped outside the bounds of what was once considered virtue. You must understand that this guilt is not the voice of the self, but of the persona, the mask you have worn to survive. The persona whispers, you should not have spoken, you should have endured, yet the self says, you have remembered who you are. To handle disrespect is not to eliminate compassion, but to liberate it from compulsion, to allow forgiveness to flow where it is pure, while withdrawing it where it is demanded. As tribute, forgiveness has been misunderstood. To forgive is not to pretend the wound did not occur, nor to sanctify the one who inflicted it. True forgiveness arises only when the soul has first honored its own pain, when the anger has been acknowledged and integrated. Otherwise, forgiveness becomes another mask, a polite lie that keeps the wound festering in the unconscious. Many empaths confuse repression with forgiveness, believing that to bury their anger is to transcend it. But the psyche does not forget. What is unacknowledged returns, often in dreams, in symptoms, in the silent erosion of joy, Forgiveness without shadow work is self-deception. Only when you have stood in your own fire, only when you have faced the storm of your indignation, can forgiveness become truth rather than performance. This is why the ending of patience must be honored as sacred. It is the moment the empath stops rehearsing sainthood and begins living wholeness. Wholeness includes the capacity to say no, to walk away, to demand respect without apology. In this wholeness, forgiveness is no longer a reflex, but a conscious act chosen when the soul is ready, withheld when it would betray dignity. The Christ who forgives is also the Christ who overturns the tables. The Buddha who radiates compassion is also the Buddha who warns against ignorance. Light without shadow is illusion, and so too is patience without limit a distortion of virtue. Integration requires courage. The empaths must sit with their own anger, not as an enemy, but as a guide. Imagine descending into a cave where a wild animal waits. You have feared this beast for years, telling yourself it must never be seen, never be unleashed. Yet, when you finally approach, you discover its eyes are not cruel, but sorrowful. It has been chained by your fear, starved by your repression. It does not wish to devour you. It wishes to protect you. This beast is your shadow, your anger, your strength. When you unchain it, it does not run rampant, but walks beside you as guardian. This is the mystery. What you feared would destroy you was always meant to defend you, and what then becomes of disrespect? It no longer defines you. It becomes an event, not an identity. When someone mocks you, ignores you, dismisses you, you no longer collapse inward or explode outward. You simply see the projection at work, the archetype of the aggressor, the unintegrated shadow of the other, and from this seeing, you decide, does this soul merit your patience, your compassion, your time? Or does this moment call for departure, for a boundary, for a firm refusal? In this decision, you are free, no longer enslaved by the need to be endlessly patient, no longer bound to the wound of disrespect. You become sovereign, able to meet the world with open heart and guarded dignity. The collective fears such sovereignty, for it cannot exploit it. An integrated empath cannot be used as an endless source of supply. They cannot be silenced by guilt, nor manipulated by the threat of rejection. They carry within them the union of opposites, the gentleness of water and the fierceness of fire, the patience of the earth and the sharpness of the sword. Such souls disrupt systems of power built on exploitation. This is why the empath's awakening is not only personal but revolutionary. When one person says, "I will no longer accept disrespect," a tremor runs through the collective psyche, and others awaken to their own dignity. In this way, individuation becomes contagious, a spark that ignites the hidden fire in many. But let us return to the mystical, for the psyche, in its deepest layers, always reveals truth through images, through symbols that transcend mere words. When patience ends, dreams may shift dramatically. A dreamer who once stood voiceless before the tribunal now sees themselves holding a staff, speaking words that resound like thunder. A dreamer who once carried a sieve now dreams of a vessel of gold that holds water without spilling. These are the gifts of the unconscious, the confirmations that the self has taken root, that the archetypes are rebalancing. To honor these dreams is to honor the dialogue between ego and self, between conscious effort and unconscious guidance. Do not fear that you will lose empathy by embracing your power. On the contrary, empathy deepens, for now it is no longer tinged with resentment, no longer exhausted by repression. It flows freely, chosen, rather than compelled. You can sit with another's pain without dissolving into it. Listen to another's disrespect without internalizing it. You know where you end and where the other begins. This is the boundary that transforms empathy from sacrifice into gift. The soul no longer says, I must endure in order to be loved. It says, I am whole, and from this wholeness I choose when to give. This is the sacred maturity of the empath. And what of those who continue to disrespect you? Their presence becomes diagnostic rather than defining. You see their actions as symptoms of their own shadow, their own wound. You no longer take it as truth about your worth. You may still feel the sting, for the soul is sensitive by nature, but the sting no longer festers into identity. You respond, you set the boundary, you walk away if needed, and then you return to your center, unbroken. This is the true miracle. Not that disrespect vanishes, but that it no longer possesses you. It comes and goes like weather, while you remain the mountain. So when your patience ends, let it end without regret. Let the fire rise. Let the shadow speak. Let the temple walls be rebuilt. And from this place of strength, allow forgiveness when it flows naturally, but never force it as a mask. Trust that your soul is wiser than your fear, that it knows when to yield and when to stand, when to endure and when to declare the sacred no. This is the art of individuation, the dance of opposites, the embrace of wholeness, the birth of the true self in the crucible of lived experience. And I say to you finally, the empath's patience was never meant to be infinite. It was meant to be the threshold, the beginning, the seed of something greater. When it ends, you discover not the death of your gift, but its transformation. For patience without power is slavery, but patience with power is majesty. In that majesty, you will walk through the world, not as victim, but as sovereign soul, luminous with compassion, yet crowned with dignity, able to love without losing yourself, able to forgive without betraying yourself, able at last to handle disrespect, not with collapse, but with the serene authority of one who knows their worth.